What is the role of infinity? In the last session, I talked about the path towards infinity, in the sense that I created a distinction between understanding what a finite object is and what infinity is. And so the finite object is anything which has a finite dimensional measure to it in so-called three-dimensional space. So let's say an apple or a rock, a tree, whereas infinite space is that homogeneous state and presence which is absolute and which also hosts all objects. And I tried to explain that it is thought that empty space is a consequence of objects, and that insofar that there are objects, then there is space, but not necessarily the other way around. That if we have space, then we would not necessarily have to have objects, these finite measures. But this is not necessarily the case if we look deeper and thoroughly at the nature of so-called empty space or infinite space, or this homogeneous quality. And if we do look and stare and focus onto what is implied when we talk about this homogeneous state, is that there is a dual quality to it. And that dual quality is that it has a passive and an active state. The passive is the one that is most obviously known, in the sense that it is, again, that host. If we were to give it an independent quality and characteristic, independent of objects, it is the non-object, it is the non-entity which permits, not by any activity, but by simply not being, it allows being to relate to each other, finite beings to relate to each other. But the other quality is its activity, and that activity is its own division, its own, to use a colloquial term, its own creation. And the activity of space as a creation is to divide itself, and by dividing itself it creates an object, something that is objected from itself. It creates a measure. Now, without going into almost infinite detail as to how and why that is, the simplest version that I can think of how this occurs is simply that infinite space as an absolutely homogeneous state, so basically empty throughout itself, is at once infinitely small and infinitely large. Now this seems to be a contradictory statement, but the reason why it actually isn't a contradictory statement is because in infinity there is no sense of measure if we were talking about empty space as being infinite. So the infinitely small and the infinitely large both have the same definition, but we are creating a division from a outside point of view. And this seems like to be a bit of a cheat to consider infinity from that point of view, But precisely because we can do that we can observe it from a removed perspective, it gives us an insight into a possible relationship that infinity could have with itself. And that relationship between the infinitely large and the infinitely small would be only one type of relationship, and that would be direction. If it were to have a relationship, of course. This part is induced. And that relationship would be that the infinitely large and the infinitely small are relating to each other with simply direction. Now, before any criticism is made that the infinitely large and the infinitely small are not one and the same because they're given, the differentiation is made by the observer, this is not entirely a sustained criticism, because what the observer is doing is simply taking one part of infinity, so the infinitely small, that infinitesimal point, and comparing it to the rest of infinity, which is outside of itself, right? The infinity at large. But if we then were to remove the separation between the two, we could say that there are actually an infinite amount of points within this larger infinity, and that these infinite amount of points are infinitely small, and therefore basically constitute the definition that infinity is infinite throughout its own infinity. Or, to put it in a different perspective, is that infinity is an infinite amount of infinitely small points throughout itself. So, to say that infinity has could have a relationship with an infinitely small point, and that it is only simply relating to itself, is to simply limit its interaction with one of its own points. But again, that point is also infinite. But the only difference is that it has a direction. So this is an attempt, at least, at showing that empty space can have, if we were to allow it, right? I mean, we can, from a different point of view, say, well, it absolutely has no relationship. But then we come into cosmological problems if we don't allow any kind of relationship, as how an object was born into space, and why there are only a limited amount of objects that were created, or if there are an infinite amount of objects, then how do we deal with the objects that were previously created, and if there was a beginning, if there was no beginning, then there is a problem with the whole issue, with the whole creation process, that it has been created for an eternity, and it is created for an eternity, but then again, the process of creation is a finite process. And so we come across a whole host of paradoxical statements and propositions, and while trying to maintain that an object is not created. The object of an infinitesimal point in the context of an infinitely large space is a process of creation. Therefore, it is an activity. And all it is doing is creating itself. Or, to put differently, it is sustaining itself. So even though that space has a passive quality of being empty, or hosting the objects within it, it is also sustaining the objects within it by just being itself. It doesn't have to do anything particular except its own homogeneous state in an absolute sense.